Greetings. I'm Pastor John Wertz. I'm one of the assistants to the bishop in the Virginia Synod. It's a pleasure to be with you as we gather digitally for worship today. Our gospel reading is from the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. So I remember the chancel area at Christ Lutheran Church as being huge. Now, I was in elementary school at the time, so it's possible that that area at the front of the church around the altar wasn't quite as big as I remember. But in my mind, the space was tremendous, which meant that when all the young people came forward for the children's sermon, there was plenty of room to create an imaginary boat where all the disciples could sit as that boat was being battered by the waves. And there was room for Jesus to be on the other side of the space, preparing to walk to the boat. The congregation watched as our gospel reading was retold, and the kids began to act out the story. Our Jesus, on cue, started walking across the water, invited Peter to come to him. The young man playing Peter did exactly what he was supposed to do. He stepped out of the boat. He walked for a little while. Then he seemed to get scared, pretended like he was drowning. And that's when the story started to change. You see, our young man who was playing Jesus suddenly marched over to where Peter was. He reached out and grabbed him by the arm. He dragged him back to the boat, put him firmly in the boat, and he said in a loud, clear voice, "Next time, stay in the boat." Next time, stay in the boat. That was his little Jesus response to the problem. Stay in the boat. For clearly, he thought, if he had stayed in the boat, Peter would have been safe. Now, certainly, next time, stay in the boat was not the intended message of that children's sermon. But all these years later, whenever I hear the story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water, I find myself hearing that phrase play in my head. Next time, stay in the boat. And I think that phrase has stuck with me because for so many people, staying in the boat is exactly what we want to do, especially when the boat is battered by the waves, when we're feeling unsettled and confused by what's happening in the world around us. When we look outside of the boat and see COVID-19 and unrest and change and calls for justice and equality, staying in the boat might feel like the best thing we can do, the safest thing we can do. The catch, of course, is that staying in the boat is not what Jesus calls us to do. Jesus ventures out into the rough waters first. And then Jesus calls Peter to join him. Come, he calls to Peter. Come walk with me. I'm here. We can do this together. And seemingly without a moment's hesitation, Peter leaves the boat and he walks on the water toward Jesus. He's doing great. And then he takes his eyes off of Jesus. He starts to focus on those rolling waves, on that howling wind. He loses sight of where Jesus is calling him to go. He seems to forget for a moment that Jesus is right there with him. And in that moment, he begins to sink. And in the midst of his fear, Peter cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and catches him. When Peter was focused on Jesus, the impossible was possible. When Peter allows the craziness of the world to pull his focus off of Jesus, that's when he starts to get in trouble. And somewhere in there, I think, is a bit of wisdom for all of us as we seek to follow Jesus. It would be much easier for Peter to stay in the boat with the other disciples. The waves were tossing the boat around. Oh, they weren't making any headway toward shore, and it probably wasn't the most comfortable place to be, but the boat isn't sinking. And there are certainly disciples on that boat who know a thing or two about boats and sailing. So the easiest choice would have been to stay in the boat, surrounded by friends, protected from the waves and the wind and the chaos of the outside world. But Jesus isn't about staying in the boat. Jesus isn't about the status quo. Jesus is out there in the world, turning over tables, having compassion for people in need, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, calling out injustice. Jesus doesn't simply stay on the shore. He heads out into the midst of the uncertainty and he calls Peter to join him. Jesus calls Peter to join him in doing something amazing, something miraculous, something dangerous. Jesus calls Peter to step out of his nice, safe world and step onto the unstable waters of the sea. Jesus calls Peter to make a leap of faith. And you know what? Peter did it. Peter did it. Peter stepped out of the boat. Peter walked on the water. Peter did it. He took the leap of faith and he did something miraculous. And then, as so often happens in our world, as so often happens when we step outside of our comfort zone, the fears and the insecurities and the doubts and the questions, they start to creep in. And in that moment, Peter begins to sink. As long as he was focused on Jesus, he was weathering the storm okay. He was doing all right. When he started focusing on the world, when he lost sight of Jesus, that's when his problems really started to become clear. But even as Peter is sinking, I think there's good news to discover. For in that moment of trouble, Peter called to Jesus for help, and Jesus reaches out his hand and returns Peter to safety. It's no different for any of us. Each of us is faced with moments in our lives of faith when God calls us out of the safety and security of the boat. Moments where God calls us to trust that with God's help, we can do something we don't think we're capable of doing. It might be a critical moment of decision. It might be an opportunity to stand against injustice, or it might simply be an opportunity to model your faith for others in the way you live and act and make decisions. each situation in our lives is going to be different, but I'm convinced the opportunities will be the same. The opportunity to step out of the safety of the boat and trust that God is with you as you step into the world to witness to God's love. And like Peter, sometimes when we get out of the boat, we will experience moments of success. We will walk on the water, so to speak. We will know that we're doing what God is calling us to do. And other times, we'll feel like we're sinking down, lost in our doubts and in our questions, lost in fear, worried about what's happening in the world around us. But even there, in that moment of need and panic, we're reminded that Jesus is with us, that Jesus reaches out to us. Sometimes that reaching out might look like a friend or a family member or a church member or a passage of scripture or a stranger. It comes in a lot of forms. But God is there in ways that are obvious and sometimes not so obvious, extending the hand of help and hope to give us something to hold on to when the world is rolling and the winds are blowing. For times, it really may be tempting in this life to just stay in the boat, to cling to the safety of what we know, of what we've always known. But the call for you and for me as children of God is not to stay in the boat. The call is to follow Jesus out into the world, to witness to Jesus' radical, inclusive love through our words, through our deeds, through our lives. Because no matter how tempting it may be to try to stay in the boat, no matter how tempting it may be to try to drag ourselves back to the boat sometimes, to look for that hand to pick us up and put us back. Remember, the call to us is, don't stay in the boat. Step boldly out into the world. Step boldly forward in faith, trusting that God will go before you and be beside you each step of the way. Amen.